Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Beaupert in Arlington, Virginia. This is part 2 of my interview with William I. Robinson, professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he works on critical globalization studies. Also, he is author of the forthcoming book, The Global Police State, published by Pluto Press in May. Thanks again, Bill, for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So in part 1 of this interview, we discussed the rise of 21st century fascism around the world and the extent to which Donald Trump is a part of this phenomenon. Now, in the second part, I want to look at the impeachment of Donald Trump from the perspective that the conflict we're witnessing in Congress is actually a battle within the US elite. Now, as I mentioned in part 1 of our interview, I highly recommend the article that you wrote last year for the journal Science and Society titled Global Capitalist Crisis and 21st Century Socialism, Trump Beyond the Hype. Now, in this article, you suggest that the US elite or ruling class is engaged in a battle over how to resolve the structural and ideological crisis of global capitalism. Now, in part 1, we already discussed what this crisis consists of. I want to turn now to how the two sides, as probably represented by Republicans and by corporate Democrats, propose to resolve this crisis. Now, since we already discovered the right-wing approach earlier, I want to focus on the corporate Democratic response. That is, how and why are these Democrats, I'm thinking specifically about the wing of the Democratic Party, of course, that Joe Biden represents and Hillary Clinton, how are they different from Trump and the Republicans?
Not very different. Not very different is the short answer, but let me break this down a bit. Let me remind the listeners, if you hadn't heard the details of part 1, that I had pointed out that the current moment, whether we're talking about impeachment in the United States, whether we're talking about headlines from anywhere around the world, the backdrop to that is the crisis of global capitalism. And I had mentioned that we have the structural dimension, and we spoke about that in part 1. But more significantly, when we talk about the US lead and its divisions, is the other dimension of that crisis, which is a crisis of state legitimacy and a capitalist hegemony. And we do have this sharp polarization worldwide between an insurgent fascist far right and insurgent forces from below, popular forces from below rising up. So let's focus on this crisis of legitimacy because it hits head on in the United States. And I had mentioned also in the first part of the interview that the most recent polls showed that the majority of women in the United States now support socialism over capitalism, but not just women. Previously, there were polls showing that the majority of millennials now, young people, prefer socialism over capitalism. So this crisis of legitimacy, of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony is worldwide, and it's particularly acute right now in the United States. And so global elites, but here we're going to talk about US elites, are deeply divided. They're deeply concerned about this crisis of legitimacy. They are aware of it. They are aware of it, which is why you see not just Trump's now talking about socialism. Trump's saying, we're never going to have a socialist United States, but you have Democratic candidates saying I'm capitalist to the bone. And you have Nancy Pelosi saying we're capitalists here when she's questioned by a millennial. Why, if a majority of us want socialism, why are you insisting on capitalism? So elites are critical. Elites in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, and this goes worldwide, but we're talking about the United States, are deeply aware of this crisis of legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. And so what they're not united around is how to respond to that crisis, how to resolve that crisis. And we are seeing a breakdown of the ruling order. And the ruling groups are asking, how do we reconstitute hegemony? How do we stabilize this system? How do we sustain the system? How do we stave off revolution or this radical rebellion from below? And there have been 3 responses that I identify. And again, this is worldwide, but we're talking about the US case, and it holds for the US case as well. A number of transnational elites, including some within the Democratic Party and including capitalist elites that are not necessarily identified with either party, are trying to save the system from itself through mild reformism, from a little bit of redistribution by taxing capital and corporations a little more, by reintroducing the funding for social programs and so forth, by some green capitalism. And this has been gaining momentum, this reformist attempt to reform the system and resolve this crisis by mild reform. But They want to resolve the crisis by mild reform, but they want to undercut radical transformation also by mild reform. But this is a minority among Democrats in the United States. It's a zero among Republicans, and it's really a minority of elites worldwide. The World Economic Forum just had its summit, its annual summit in Davos, and there we saw the voices of this transnational reformist elite, but they're minority. So then you have within the US elite, putting aside those reformers, you have the Democrats representing more of the same. You mentioned Biden, and Biden is the classical example, and of now the former mayor of New York also, and Buttigieg. All of them are simply more of the same, simply more of what we got with Obama and much of what we got with Trump, which is continued war mobilization and massive financing for war in the military-industrial complex, more neoliberal structural adjustments, a little more kinder, a little more friendlier than Trump's neoliberal structural adjustment and austerity and so forth. And then you have, of course, that far-right response that we analyzed in the first part of the interview. So the U.S. elite, reflecting the larger transnational elite, is deeply divided. Now, let me analyze this by looking a moment at this impeachment process. And on the one hand, this impeachment process is somewhat of a farce because Trump's real crimes, the war crimes around the world, the crimes of separating children from their families and locking them up in concentration camps, all of these real crimes have also been committed by the Democrats. So they have no real division in that regard. And let's remember that both Democrats and Republicans are beholden to the same transnational capitalist class, to the financial industry, to the military-industrial complex, to oil and gas interests, and so on, basically to the agenda of the transnational capitalist class. The Democrats are not impeaching Trump because he's privatized even more the U.S. economy and the global economy, that he's deregulated any and everything, that he's imposed taxes which are unbelievably regressive, that he's busting unions, that he's imposing austerity and cutting social budgets. The Democrats might complain about that a little, but they're not impeaching Trump for that. So I think the Democrats who are leading this impeachment, the mainstream of the Democratic Party, the bigwigs who are so tied to the corporations, are more upset with Trump for other reasons. And one reason is that the U.S. elite is always supposed to respect each other. It's okay that Trump kills other people abroad. It's okay that he attacks the working class in the United States. But it is not okay that he goes after his political rival in this illegal way, in this underhand way. And let's remember that Watergate, if we want to go a little back in history, Nixon was forced to resign on the eve of impeachment because he broke into Democratic Party headquarters, not because of all of the crimes that he committed. And Democrats are also, and when I hear Democrats, I'm talking about the actual political elites that are so tied to the corporate elite. They're also have been deeply concerned about Trump's reckless, buffoon-like conduct. So the Democrats have a different strategy for responding to the crisis of legitimacy. If Trump's strategy is a fascist mobilization, hinged on racism and rebuilding and reconstituting a white racist historic bloc and intensifying the war against immigrants and so forth. The Democrats have among other things, this strategy of looking for the external enemy, which is Russia. So you have Hillary Clinton and so forth constantly talking about Russia, but it's not that Russia is a threat to transnational capitalist interests of the United States. It's because this is the way mass social anxiety and the crisis of legitimacy is channeled towards some external enemy. But I want to stress here, Greg, that the U.S. elite is rudderless. They don't have a strategy to confront this crisis of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. And I want to conclude this, responding to this part of your interview, by saying that the Democrats, meaning the mainstream elites, are more scared of a Sanders campaign and of this insurgency of the left and this rising popularity of socialism than they are of Trump. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They have to oppose Trump, and there's mass sentiment against Trump is their own social base. And they have to oppose the left within the Democratic Party and outside of the Democratic Party. So they're facing their own party crisis.
Well, yeah, that's something actually I want to conclude with. I want to ask you about this polarization and the fragmentation of the political spectrum that you're talking about. as you said, the left wing of the Democratic Party has gotten stronger now, just as the right wing of the Republican Party has gotten stronger. Actually, they dominate the Republican Party now, but that's not the case in the Democratic Party. That is, the left wing doesn't dominate. And right now, with the primary campaign, we see this battle actually going on between the left wing and the center for the heart of the Democratic Party now, and that's represented by Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Now, if Sanders wins the nomination, it seems that the real question in this battle against Trump's authoritarianism and neo-fascism, if you want to call that, would be who will side with the corporate Democrat? Who will the corporate Democrats side with? Will they side with Trump or will they side with Sanders? As you said, they're really opposed and afraid of Sanders. So, what do you think will happen?
I think if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, this is going to present a tremendous crisis for the Democratic Party as a party. Tremendous crisis, because if they side with Trump, that's it. The Democratic Party will dissolve. Imagine Democratic Party supporting not just any old Republican candidate, but a far-right, fascist Republican candidate that the base of the Democratic Party voters cannot stand, detests, and is trying to get rid of. And if they side with Bernie, they're going to have to bring all of those resources, all of the party's resources into the Sanders campaign. So there's a couple scenarios I can imagine. One is that they officially support Bernie. That's their nomination. That's their candidate. But they don't do anything very enthusiastic to get him elected. The other one, of course, is what ruling groups always do when they're faced with this situation, is the politics of co-optation, right? So let's say, hypothetically, they have to mobilize around Bernie Sanders. They have no choice because, again, that would throw the Democratic Party in such a crisis it might even dissolve, like if they backed Trump. So they back Bernie. Let's say Bernie becomes president, but do everything possible to structurally contain anything Bernie can do, and to isolate Bernie and to force a Bernie administration to be surrounded by generals in the Pentagon and corporate representatives in the Treasury and so forth. I mean, a massive politics of co-optation. But I want to say that it's at times of crisis where there's tremendous amount of uncertainty and things can go in so many different directions. So you're asking a very important question, what the Democrats will do if Bernie wins the nomination. But we're at times of crisis in which anything can happen and things change very rapidly and things are very, very, very unpredictable. So these are not normal times, right? This is not even 2008, for instance, when Obama got the nomination and became president. This is we haven't seen a conjuncture like this. Really, I would dare to say since the 1930s. This where we're at this point. And of course, in the 1930s, we didn't face the existential crisis of ecological collapse, and we also didn't face in the 1930s such incredible means of violence and destruction at a global level at a time of acute crisis. So we've got to fasten our seatbelts.
Yeah. I mean, I think also the comparison to the 1930s is interesting in the sense that, of course, back then, Franklin Roosevelt won the nomination, and he was very clear that he's a capitalist, even though he took the reform course in order to save capitalism. That's something, well, you could say that maybe that's the course that Sanders will take, but it will be much more difficult for him given the continuing crisis of global capitalism that doesn't seem to be resolvable in the short term, whereas in the 1930s, it did seem to present a solution, right?
Right. I would add on that also that at this point of globalized capitalism, the structural power of transnational finance capital is really overwhelming. So capital, putting aside the Democrats, right, politically in Congress and so forth, capital has this enormous power to undermine any, the progressive elements of a Bernie Sanders administration. Wall Street and the financial markets can withdraw massive amounts of capital from the United States and transfer them to other parts of the global economy. So there are many different ways to either to fully sabotage, a Sanders presidency, or to keep it tightly under control. But all of those things might sabotage, Bernie Sanders' program and its most radical elements. But it will also aggravate the underlying structural crisis that we've been talking about in the crisis of legitimacy. So here's the thing. There's no way out for US and transnational elites. They're not going to be able to get out of this crisis. So the key question is, will it be radical and left forces and popular forces from below that take advantage of this expanding crisis to push humanity, the United States, but humanity more generally, in the direction we need to go for our own survival? Or will it be these far-right forces, militarized forces, and World War III that we're facing gains the upper hand in response to this expanding crisis of global capitalism?
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to William I. Robinson, professor of sociology at UC Santa Barbara. Thanks again, Bill, for having joined us today and for this very interesting analysis.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.